Hey everybody, welcome to Polar Bears International Tundra Connections program. I'm CJ Carter, I'll be your host today. And it's polar bear season up here in Churchill, which means we're coming to you live from Buggy 1 right on the shores of Hudson Bay. It's about 20 degrees Celsius, below Celsius outside, and bears are waiting for pack ice to fully form. Today we'll be talking about observing change here in the western Hudson Bay over the years. To my right is photographer Dan Cox of the Arctic Documentary Project, and to my left is polar bear ecologist Dr. Ian Stirling. Combined, these guys have over 60 years of field time here and some really fascinating observations about how this environment is changing. Before we get into it, I want to invite all of you to submit any questions you may have during the broadcast to questions@pbears.org or into the chat window just to the side of the video here. We'll do our best to answer them, so fire those off. I'd like to start with Dan. The aim of the Arctic Documentary Project is to create a photographic and written record of the changes taking place here. What makes up this question, and why is this an important body of work?
Well, I've been coming here working as a professional photographer for over 30 years as a professional, but coming here to the western Hudson Bay region for 20 years and documenting these bears and the wildlife and nature that goes on in this ecosystem. I've noticed over this period of time what seems to be a pretty substantial change in the stature and health of these bears, at least from a layman's perspective. I want to make it clear I'm a photographer, a journalist. Dr. Stirling Ian Stirling is the expert on these animals, and we'll go with the information that he gives us for sure. But from a visual perspective, we've seen a big change as far as the size of these bears. And it's unique that I've been coming back to this region for such a long, extended period of time. But that's the type of thing I like to work on on the projects that I typically take on, are long-term projects, life history type projects of specific animals. The ADP, known as what we call the ADP, also known as the Arctic Documentary Project, is going to be a collection of images over time. It originally started with Dr. Dan Gurevich, who was coming here even before I was, and has several decades of photography from this same region of this same general population of polar bears. And it's interesting, what got me interested in looking at this from a historical perspective is his work early on and how big those animals were compared to what we're seeing today. So our goal is to continue to chronicle not only this population, but expand it out across the Arctic, all parts of the Arctic in general, Greenland, hopefully maybe some work in Russia, the Canadian Arctic, Svalbard, in that area, and document some of the changes that are taking place. The Arctic is the fastest changing ecosystem in the world based on this warming climate, and because of this, we're seeing these changes taking place extremely quickly, and so we want to document some of the things that are still here. The polar bears being one of them, and we've just happened to have a good, long-term collection of images already.
Right. Well, on that same note, Ian, you've been up in this region for nearly half of a century. Can you tell us a little bit about your work here in the western Hudson Bay region? What does that work entail, and what are you seeing emerge from that?
Well, I guess what I'd do is I'd put that work in a larger framework to start with, in that I've been working for the last 40+ years in a variety of areas in the Canadian Arctic. We've been trying to look in some detail at the relationships between bears, sea ice, and seals. We've been doing a lot of long-term observations of undisturbed bears so that we learn a little bit about what bears are doing when they're not running away from hunters or biologists. We've done a lot of mark and recapture studies, and we've done a lot of satellite tracking, and that's given us a level of detail about what the bears are actually doing, so that we can interpret some of the things that we're seeing about bears and sea ice. Now, here in Hudson Bay, I originally got interested in long-term natural fluctuations in the ecosystem, and some of the things that we'd seen in the Beaufort Sea in the Western Arctic were indicated that some very large-scale changes could take place for perfectly natural reasons. But you'd need to understand those before you could really bring in meaningful conservation and management things. So we started working here in Western Hudson Bay because it is a little bit less expensive to be able to work on the animals. Also, we get open water in the summer, so the whole population is on land where they're easy to find in the summer. White bears on a dark background are a lot easier to find than white bears on a vast snow or ice scape. So we did a lot of things in terms of monitoring the weights of the bears, the sizes of the bears, their growth rates, the number of cubs that they were having, how old the cubs were when they were weaned, how well bears of different age and sex classes survived. And so that was the long-term database that we set out to do.
Very well. And as I can understand it, you and your then graduate student, Dr. Andrew DeRoche, were the first few folks in the scientific community to explore a possible link between global warming and the decline in the health and the condition of polar bears. Can you tell us when you first had an inkling that there might be a connection?
Well, we'd been doing this monitoring for about 15 years, and I'd had a number of grad students over the time, and then Andy came along, and we were looking at population ecology and population dynamics as part of his thesis work. And when we looked at the weights of bears of all ages and sex classes, we could see that they were declining. We could see these fluctuations between years in sort of what I refer to as the long-term fluctuations that go on, natural variation in any ecosystem. But here we were seeing fluctuations like this, but we were seeing a long-term trend toward decline in weight. And this was about the late 1980s. And began to think, well, maybe something else is going on here. And then two other little pieces of observation came along. One was Dan Gurovich, who was referred to earlier, who had been photographing bears here for a long time. And one day he said to me in the late 80s, "Where have all the great big bears gone?" Well, I knew the bears were still here, but what he was saying is they were used to seeing these great big bears with really big round rear ends and had massive heavy bodies, but you weren't seeing that anymore. Big heavy bears like that, the bears were still there, and they were still just as big and long and so on, but they were fairly lanky and relatively thin, like that bear you saw walking away from us just right at the beginning of the program. That was live right outside the window. The other thing that we saw when Dr. DeRoche and I when he was a student, we were working here, is all of a sudden we started catching adult females with new cubs that had new cubs the year before. And I thought, what's going on here? And then we suddenly realized maybe some of those cubs are dying. And so we thought, well, if climate warming is involved with this, you should be able to make a number of specific hypotheses to test. You don't just want to be going out and grabbing things and not knowing what you're really talking about. So we made a number of predictions, such as that if climate was warming, the ice ought to break up earlier in Hudson Bay. If the ice is breaking up earlier, the bears would have less time to feed, and they would be coming ashore a little bit lighter. As if this continued over a period of time, they would start to have fewer cubs. The cubs would not survive as well. They wouldn't be recruited into the population, and eventually the population would begin to decline. And in Western Hudson Bay now, we've seen all of those kinds of things, and we're seeing some of them in some other populations which are being similarly affected, but they're a few years behind what we're seeing here in Western Hudson Bay.
Right on. Well, with those observations and that variation in mind, what are conditions like this year along the Western Hudson Bay through your lens? What are you seeing, and what's the weather doing? What are the bears doing?
Well, interestingly, this year is the first year in probably 6 or 7 that I flew into Winnipeg for the same time, and I've been coming at about relatively the same time each year for the last 20 years. And Winnipeg was a little more wintry much more wintry than it was last year. It was a little more towards typical what I would normally see as many as 10 to 12 years ago. There still wasn't any snow on the ground. There was a little bit of snow spitting, but I remember my first trip here to Winnipeg in 1987, November 4th. I arrived in 1987, and to get out of our hotel to go to to get dinner that night. I remember specifically to having to climb over a couple snowbanks to get across the street, and I haven't seen snowbanks in Winnipeg for at least I'd say for sure 8 to 10 years, and maybe even longer. And so it's interesting as you come back to a place every year for a long period of time, and you remember these changes, take notes and keep track of these changes. And in the last few years, it's been just amazing how it's been Indian summer. It's been leaves still on the trees and literally no snow. Now, but what's interesting this year is we have had a little more of a normal winter, it seems, and this is why it's so important. Ian talks about long-term studies, keeping track of things over a long period of time, because things can do some interesting changes on a short-term basis, but long-term is what's so important to keep track of this stuff, and that's why their data that they have collected over the, I guess, 30 years of studying, I believe it is, here in the Western Hudson Bay population of polar bears. That's why it's so important to take this information into account, because it is long-term. It's not just what we've seen over, let's say, the last year or two. This year, the bears are actually getting out. I think are going to get out on the ice a little early if the weather continues as it has. As you mentioned, it was 20 below Celsius, minus 20 below. That is forming the ice on the bay, and we're seeing a lot more ice out there than we have at years past in the last recent years than we've seen at this time in years past. And that's really encouraging for the bears. We still have plenty to take pictures of, and we're getting some great footage that will be a part of the Arctic documentary project that we've talked about. We're collecting those things, but we're a little more on schedule, it seems like, this year. But boy, the last 10 years, really warm and difficult to get wintry looking polar bear pictures.
Right. And for you, Ian, what are you seeing with the bears? Are they looking healthy? Are you seeing as many as usual? And what are the cubs looking like, etc.?
Well, if anything, we're probably seeing a few less bears, fewer bears than usual. But these things come and go. Some years there's a few more, some years a few less. And it's sort of like the weather. You get a cold day and a warm day, or a cold year and a warm year. But what you're really interested in looking at is the sort of longer term trends. So we're not seeing quite as many bears here. That's interesting in itself. Most of the bears that we are seeing are fairly lean. They're certainly not the big fat males like Dan was referring to that we used to see regularly 15 years ago or 20 years ago. The other thing that I'm really quite interested in, relative to the predictions that we made that we would be seeing fewer cubs and the survival would be poorer, there was a big survey conducted here last year by the government of Nunavut, and it was a very thorough survey, aerial survey over both the coastal areas and the inland areas, and they saw several hundred polar bears altogether, which was fine, but less than 3% of those animals were yearlings. Now, in a normal healthy population, you would expect to see 8, 10, 12% of the total number of animals that you saw should be yearlings. So what that says is that the number of cubs that the females are able to support and bring through into the following year means that a lot of the cubs aren't living through their first year, and that's a very serious concern, because it means that the recruitment into the population is probably not enough to maintain it, and so the population will probably continue to decline a little bit.
Wow. And Dan, for you, you've spent a lot of time in these regions and being able to be exposed to issues like that with the cubs. And what brings you here year after year? And you know, it takes a lot to go out there with a camera in hand at 30 below Celsius and snap away. And you know, what draws you to this work and this place, and why is this something that is worth preserving?
Well, you know, this all kind of gets back to the whole idea of the Arctic Documentary Project. Studying something long-term, number one, is always interesting from a kind of a scientific perspective. It's also important, it's been proven in years past, things like the Farm Securities Administration, who was responsible for hiring photographers at one time to document some of the most difficult times in our nation's history, such as the Dust Bowl area, the Great Depression, etc. And at that time, the government was actually hiring photographers to go out and document these sorts of things. I know of no programs like that at all, of anything like that. And that's part of what the ADP hopes to fill in is by going after donations and hopefully working with corporations and individuals to be able to raise these monies to do this documentary work. But from my own personal standpoint of being crazy enough to come back here, 20 plus years, the same place to see these animals, it's always inspiring to me to see how animals live in difficult conditions that we as humans would have no concept of how to get by at this point anymore. There are some cultures that still understand real difficult times, but when I'm on the back deck of one of these buggies or in a situation where I'm documenting some of these animals and I see a mother and cubs, where she's gaunt, skinny. It's obvious. We had a situation a couple years ago that I documented that was very difficult to watch, where the cubs were obviously not nursing. We watched them over a 3-day period, and never did they nurse. And she had gotten to a point. Obviously, she looked like basically furry skin hanging off of what seemed to be bones. And it's those things that help tell the story, and it's important to bring those images, whether it's through still images or video, to the masses, and help tell the story to people that these animals, whether it's polar bears or the lemmings or the snowy owls or whatever that live in this really difficult Arctic environment, are having a difficult time because of what we have helped what we have as humans have added to the whole carbon emissions issue that we're experiencing from climate change, and to shoot these pictures and bring them to people to help them be inspired, educate them, and then hopefully inspire them to say, I want to do my part. And that's a big part of what this whole Tundra Connections is about. My Planet, My Part is the first step for people to be able to get to the web, take a look at what PBI, Polar Bears International, has to offer for ideas and inspiration to all of us do our part, so that those little baby polar bears we're talking about can eventually start feeding again.
Absolutely. And a closing question with Ian, we're up here and we're documenting these incredible places. Is it too late to turn this around? And what can anyone do on an individual level to really make a difference?
Well, it's probably not too late at some point. We've lost a certain amount of ground, and we can't get that back easily. We probably have maybe 20 years, some people think, if we could get organized globally to be able to reduce our carbon footprint, reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are going into the environment. But even if you had a magic wand and you could change things overnight, there would be 20 years before you could slow the system down, the amount of change and heat that's gone into things. But that doesn't mean that we should give up, because there is definitely hope if we act together. As individuals, we can do all kinds of things, like reduce our carbon footprint by walking instead of driving in times that it works, turning out lights, all manner of things like recycling and so on. But the big ticket items are the burning of hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal. That probably accounts for 2/3 of the greenhouse gases that are going on. So it means that we're got to collectively encourage our politicians and our leaders that we want a world that's not totally destroyed by climate warming, to be around for our children and our grandchildren. So I think the things we do ourselves are very important, and Polar Bears International has a number of those suggestions on its website. It's well worth visiting. The other thing we need to do is convince our politicians that a 4-year electoral cycle is a very short period of time to try and address a question like this. It's going to take leaders with vision and leadership for 15, 20, 25 years before we start to see progress. But if we don't start soon, it's going to be progressively more difficult.
Thank you, Ian. Well, thank you guys for your work. And at this point, I'd like to open it up to the audience. We have some questions written in here online. And I'd like to start it off with a question for Dr. Stirling. I had the pleasure of documenting bears last week with Dan. After looking at my images in the high winds, I noticed that the bears were squinting. Do their eyes have a second eyelid, like an eagle, that protects them from the wind-driven snow and brush? And what? How How does
they
that
have a thing called a nictitating membrane. That's just kind of a big word, but it means basically just a little thin layer that comes over the eyelid, and yes, it does protect it. People also ask me why don't they get snowblind, and I don't really have an answer for that. The nictitating membrane may play a role there, or it may not. I don't really know.
Right on. And a question for Dan: what is the most challenging Arctic animal that you've ever photographed? And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the one that comes right to my top of my mind is the brown lemming. Lots of historical stories about lemmings running off of cliffs and so on and so forth. But the lemming is a big part of how the Arctic survives. It comes and goes in cycles. So as a photographer, most of the time what you're doing is you're trying to find the data that suggests where and when the most animals that you're looking for are going to be. And it's tough to find out with lemmings. They kind of appear one year and the next year they're gone. Many of the other animals in the Arctic survive on these little critters. They're like hors d'oeuvres for the foxes, for the snowy owls, for the long-tailed weasels. Wolverines eat them. Polar bears would probably grab one if they could catch one if they're on land during the summertime. But they're challenging because they're tiny. They're very fast, and they don't like to be photographed. The polar bears, if you get out into a situation where you can put yourself in the right place, they're big, easy targets to get your camera on. And the little lemmings are a lot of times under the ice, under the snow, and it's probably been one of the most difficult things I've ever photographed. But they're a lot of fun. They're really cute.
Wow. And one question for Dr. Stirling from Jenny at SeaWorld in San Diego. What do you think are two of the most important or impactful climate change facts that can increase public awareness?
Well, probably one of them is that the Arctic Ocean is we're losing sea ice there at a rate of about 12 or 13% per decade. We've got less than now about half the sea ice we had. Only in 1979. That's not very long ago. I think that's one of the most important statistics. And I think that the other thing that, in terms of the kinds of things that we're trying to talk about, is that the loss of that sea ice translates immediately to the loss of polar bears, because the one thing that polar bears absolutely have to survive is sea ice, because they use that as a platform from which to hunt seals or any other kind of marine mammals. They can scavenge on dead ones along the coast in the open water season, and they can even catch, very occasionally they'll catch a seal in the open water. But without that ice to be there for the bears to hunt from, and for long enough to be able to put on enough fat to survive through the open water season, which is getting longer and longer in many parts of the Arctic now, they're not going to make it.
Thank you very much. And one question that just came in from Timothy Brooks, and it's something that it kind of bases back onto your observations here in the western Hudson Bay region. And are the numbers of bears continuing to drop? And what about the data of the Hudson freezing long enough for them to hunt? Is that later? Is it later than what you've seen?
That's a good question, Timothy. One of the things we are seeing is that the date of breakup is getting earlier and earlier. In only 30 years, it's now become an average of full 3 weeks earlier. And of course now that means that more heat is going into the water in the summer, and it's freezing up later and later. And in the last number of years, between 1987 and about 2004, we documented about a 22% decline in the size of the population. Exactly where it is right now, we're just in the middle of analyzing all the data, and hopefully in a few more months we'll have an answer to that. But it stands to reason that if you're not recruiting young animals, if the young animals aren't surviving and making it into the adult population, the population in the long term can't do anything but decline.
Thank you. Another question for Dan. Aside from the change in the condition of polar bears, are you seeing changes in other Arctic animals through your lens over the years?
Well, that's a good question. It's difficult to actually an absolute on that question. You know, the polar bears are such big animals that we've spent so much time, and we have such good recorded documentary images of, that you can go back to these pictures and see how different they are. You know, I've got a good friend who I did a story with on snow owls back in the early 2000s. Denver Holt of the Owl Research Institute, and Denver is now also collaborating with us here at Polar Bears International. And Denver, you know, every year, his study's been going on for 20 years now, and every year we go back and we hope to see more snow owl nests or make a decision on whether there's going to be a snow owl season or not. And I can't say for sure if he's seen a trend. He feels that even 20 years is not really long enough to make an absolute prediction or make an absolute statement on how that climate changes affect snow owls. But I do know that being able to go there and see these birds one year, like I did in 2000, I believe we had our most number of nests, and then since then have seen nothing even anywhere close to the same number of nests. Now, is that tied into climate change? We can't say, but it's very possible. It's just it's one of these things that Ian talks about. It could be just this long-term cycle, but the polar bears are the animals that really give us something that have been so heavily documented, from not only from my work and other photographers' works, but people who come here to Churchill with Frontiers North Adventures to see the bears. We've got literally millions and millions of pictures of these animals, and so a big part of the reason that has happened is because these polar bears are the poster child, really, if you use that term as an example, that they attract people to pay attention, and that's why Polar Bears International is so important. And the polar bear becomes our hook, if you will, to get people interested in what's going on in the Arctic. And polar bears are a perfect example of bringing people in, showing them the differences that we've seen in this long-term period that we've been documenting their lives, and then hopefully translating that into other Arctic species such as the snow owl, the lemmings, the muskox, you know, the many different creatures that live up here, the bearded seal, the ringed seals, the ice creatures that live below the ice, and all the animals that are part of the ecosystem in the sea. So, you know, as a photographer, I don't have another good example, long story short, but there's bound to be other data out there that will show the similar information as the scientists collect it, put it together, and distribute it. And if you're interested in seeing those things, keep an eye on Polar Bears International. We're working with more and more great scientists to help bring that work to people.
Ian, you had something to add?
Yeah, just one quick one. The polar bear is one of the most adapted animals to Arctic ice. The other one is its main food source, the ringed seal, of which there are probably 6 or 7 million of them out there. And the key thing is that the ringed seals stay small. They're only really sort of 3 feet long, that sort of thing. And they maintain their own breathing holes in the sea ice with the claws on their foreflippers. And in the springtime, they come up through the ice into the snow up above and dig out a little snow cave or a birth lair in which to give birth to their young. And what we're seeing now, was the weather is warmer in the spring, we're getting rain earlier and earlier, is that more and more of these lairs are collapsing prematurely or being literally washed right away by rain. And when that happens, the small pup is out on the sea ice, and it's killed by foxes or by polar bears. And some people say, well, maybe that's a good thing if bears get to eat more seals. Well, it isn't, because if they are killing the seals when they're young, it's before they've got the fat on them, and so they're not getting the nutritional benefit. This is a much more difficult area to document on the long term, the way we have with the polar bears. But from what we have seen in some number of short-term instances, it's very clear that climate warming is going to have highly significant negative effects on ringed seals.
Thank you. One more question for you, Dr. Stirling. People have said that there are more polar bears than ever. What's something that can explain that and kind of give it some reason?
Well, I have to put that into context. There are about 19 different populations of polar bears or subpopulations of polar bears around the world. The one in western Hudson Bay here that we've been studying is one of them. Now, when bears get into poorer condition and they're having to live on their stored fat resources for longer and longer, they start to run out and they start to get hungry in the fall. And here in Churchill, just near where we are right at the moment, they have had increasing numbers of problem bears over the last few years, and there's a direct relationship. It's very interesting. The earlier the ice breaks up, the poorer the bears, poorer condition overall that the bears come ashore, and so the more of them go looking for an alternate food source later in the fall, which usually means a town, a garbage dump, a hunting camp, something like that. Well, further up the coast in Nunavut, and the Inuit settlements there, they do a lot of hunting and so on, and have various seals and whale parts and so on around in the village, and that attracts bears. And so you get, in the last few years, we've been having more and more bears going into the villages. So it's quite true, they're seeing more bears than they have for the last 20 years. But it's not because the population's increasing, it's actually decreasing, and the bears are in poorer condition and going into the villages looking for something to eat. So it is a very good example of where the local knowledge is telling us, yes, something very significant is happening here. We're seeing more and more bears. There might be 2 or 3 different possible explanations for it, but we know now pretty clearly that the problem is that they're becoming lighter because of the effects of climate warming.
Building off that, we have another question for you, Dr. Stirling. Can't polar bears just adapt to living on land? I've read that they're starting to eat goose eggs instead, and as far as adaptations.
The short answer is no. They can't adapt to live off, go back to being land animals. It's true that they do eat goose eggs, berries, occasionally some fish, scavenge, but these are just like jelly beans or little snacks. They're not anywhere near enough to support the caloric requirement of polar bears over the big scene. I'll give you just a little bit of an example there. The average polar bear, it requires approximately 40 to 43 ring seals per year, or ring seal equivalents. For example, the bearded seal is much bigger than a ring seal, so it might be worth 3 or 4 ring seal equivalents. Now, that's if you got a population of 1,000 polar bears, that means that they're going to be needing 43,000 ring seals or their equivalent for just to survive for a year. Now, that's a lot of goose eggs, and it's taken polar bears several hundred thousand years to evolve into polar bears. They're not going to turn around and evolve into something else and be able to live on the land in only 100 years or so. Simply not going to happen. It's the sort of thing that the climate deniers like to say at regular intervals is simply not true.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your perspectives. I'd like to thank the audience for all their participation. It's great to get questions from you guys, as always. I'd like to remind you that time does remain to make some contributions to save this Arctic ecological environment, and by reducing our greenhouse emissions, especially in places like the U.S., Canada, we can do a lot to make this happen. First, we'd like to thank you for things you're already doing, like consuming less energy, riding your bike, driving that car a few years longer, or you're just taking shorter showers. What else can you do, you might ask? We have this new No Idle toolkit. You can find it on our website, and it's a great way to reduce CO2, and it's a great classroom exercise project. As I said, it's on our website for details, and there you'll find a bunch of other ideas. Next, we want to invite you to join us on our new My Planet, My Part Community Center on the PBI website, where you can join forums on how to make a difference for polar bears and share your photos and videos as far as what you're doing to reduce your carbon footprint. We'd love to hear what you're doing at your home and in your community. The launch of our new My Planet, My Part includes a contest that will run through November 26th. And what's at stake is a grand prize trip to come up here to Churchill to check out this really, really neat environment. And that will be in 2013. So finally, visit our Tundra Connections page on our website and take our post-broadcast survey. This helps us a lot. Participants will be entered in a drawing to win a free polar bear adoption. Thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to catching you soon.